Hello, my panelists are there. Could you please introduce yourself? Anyone?
Hi, this is Priyanshi. All the best, everyone.
Hi, Youngwoo Park here. All the best.
Hello, I'm Uy. Good luck for the finals. No preferred pronouns.
Hello, this is Masud. Good luck for the finals. No preferred pronouns.
Okay, great. I think that's all. And without further ado, let's call upon Prime Minister to start this round. Be here. Prime Minister.
Hello, sorry. I just got my timer. Oh, sorry. Hi everyone. My name is Loys. I'll be the Prime Minister for the Grand Finals. My POI preference would be through voice. I'll try to take a POI around 4 minutes, 5 minutes, preferably from closing for better engagement. All right. 1, 2, 3. In the standard regrets debate, there needs to be a standard, right? We need to present trends that this particular romanticization of moving on as a coping mechanism for experiencing struggles has failed to uphold the catharsis that you're supposed to feel after experiencing a struggle. This is the burden that OG wants to prove to you and will prove this to you in twofold later on. What exactly is romanticization? Romanticization means you always put a premium on the idea of moving on. You always have to see it as a priority outlook whenever you have or experience a struggle. It is the primary thing that you opt into or you have to do in these particular kinds of struggles. A lot of people almost always opt into it because it's what's common in the media, and this is how romanticization takes place in status quo. You see it in movies, you see it in films. It's the primary option when you talk to your friends because it's what's being shown on social media as well. In movements, it's the rhetoric that governments and leaders tell you whenever you experience a personal or collective struggle. That, hey, if there's a problem now and we lost, for example, a political rally, or we lost the forwarding of our policies, it's okay, we can move on. Now, what then is the problem of the romanticization of moving on? We believe that it has lapses in how it's being consumed by people and how it's being portrayed in media. Moving on has essentially boiled down to being shown as forgetting about the problem entirely and not showing the entire process of how it's supposed to be dealt with. The problem with romanticization is that there are information shortcuts, mainly through social media, mainly through movies that have a limited amount of time for you to showcase what moving on really is. They try to romanticize the idea of how you need to let the argument pass by, forgetting the conflict with your loved one, for example, and just say sorry even though you never really processed your emotions. It doesn't necessarily show or depict how exactly you processed that emotion, how exactly you were able to achieve the catharsis that I was talking about. Even in social media, influencers don't show the process of healing or the process of healing from a video that they got canceled on. They immediately tell people, oh, we need to move on from this because I already learned, without necessarily talking about what they learned or how they learned, right? Because of this romanticization, it leaves room for no other options because it becomes the primary idea or primary thing that you always opt into, even though the understanding of moving on is really it's not what it's supposed to be. This is not what moving on is supposed to be, because we know that there's a healthier way of dealing with emotions and struggles where you have to deal with it and process your feelings. What kind of struggles are we talking about? We're talking about first personal individual struggles. You didn't pass the exam or you didn't break in a tournament. On our side, instead of choosing to move on, I'd rather choose to stay in the bubble of what I did incorrectly in that that tournament? Why exactly didn't I break? But secondly, on the collective struggle, we think that moving on is therefore an option amongst others, right? But we do not allow for its romanticization. Other equal options can exist, and these are the type of things that we would rather have. Talk about being able to process emotions first before moving on, or if they don't want to move on and they want to be more confrontational about that kind of matter, that's also valid. Even the idea of holding a grudge as a trigger warning, holding a grudge on a sexual harassment victim, for example, and never forgiving your perpetrator, we think that's a valid trade-off we're willing to take, a valid engagement we're willing to take. Even if you want to always remember the struggle and you never want to move on from it, that's also valid. And we value that people have different ways of coping with the experiences of their struggles. But secondly, we don't want romanticization to be the primary mechanism that people opt into. But first argument later. Romanticizing moving on has became the dominant narrative and is now harming how we actually cope and build relationships. What exactly is this coping mechanism for? For you as an individual to achieve catharsis, you use it as a way for you to digest you have to use it as a way for you to digest what is happening, assess how you can deal with your emotions, and actually stray away from the negative feeling, right? Catharsis happens in two ways. Number one, when you're able to give yourself freedom to understand the nuances of your problems. Secondly, when you have options to deal with said problems. You don't get this on opposition side. Onto freedom, right? You are always locked onto the idea of moving on because of the heavily romanticization. It's difficult for you to opt into something else because of the social norm that's placed on romanticization. People who go against the dominant narrative are then depicted as unusual or abnormal. When I talk to people that, hey, I kind of don't want to forget about that one thing my friend said that is super horrible, I don't want to forget about that, and people say, no, just move on from it, they see me as someone who's different. I become alienated from that social group or from that particular kind of collective. When you talk about it to other people and nobody else can connect with you, that is where you lose the ability to have the freedom, and you're more likely to be peer pressured into also moving on, even though you don't want to. So you don't necessarily deal with your emotions. You don't necessarily assess what is happening and what exactly you want. You don't necessarily achieve the catharsis. But on to the second one. When you have options to deal with said problems, that's definitely not something that opposition can have as a benefit, right? Because when we subscribe to moving on as a dominant narrative, it becomes so much harder for you to have a safe space, even if you relapse, especially if you relapse, right? Because of course, when you have a problem, when you haven't experienced a struggle, it's almost always you're not going to be okay. It's not a linear, constant feeling of contentment or happiness. There's always chances for you to relapse and always be affected by that experience or that struggle again. When you subscribe to the romanticization of moving on, you're known to already forget about this, even after 3 months, even after 6 months. When you talk about how your ex was so toxic to you, even after like a year of your breakup, you're probably again going to be alienated by your friends and talk about, wait, didn't you already move on? Why are you still talking about this? So it leaves you then therefore don't have any avenues to talk about the relapse or deal with it now. But before anything else, sure, Xiao.
What do you prefer then as a method of coping mechanism? Because processing your feeling and such is part of moving on. Like literally, moving on is not equal to you having amnesia.
Look, that's the problem. Because of the romanticization, people have a skewed idea of moving on. Moving on our side, it's much more likely to be comprehended as something that actually takes time, that actually isn't linear, and you can fall back into a relapse. What then is the impact of this argument? There's a lack of accountability. Firstly, on a personal level, you won't try to make people who hurt you accountable, because the idea of romanticization pressures you into moving on. For example, your perpetrator already moved on, and for you to also move if people subscribe to the romanticization of moving on, you also have to subscribe to that moving on, even though you're not ready yet. But on a more social and collective phenomenon, when a government, for example, fails a social movement, or when a government fails a certain minority group, they always try to use this narrative as their rhetoric to give them fake promises and false promises, and use it as a narrative to tell them, hey, we can move on from this, and not necessarily like give reparations to these particular minorities. More on that later. We are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Great. We thank our speaker for her remarks. Now we invite the leader of opposition here.
Am I visible and am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Let me just put my notes in place here. Vignesh, my POI preference is through chat, but I usually will just queue people one if I don't see it. at the 5th or 6th minute. Hold on. Okay, let me just set up this timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, people are not as stupid as OG want to claim. People have their own logical calculus, and people actually know when and when not they should opt into things or not opt into things. I think then that the characterization coming from OG in today's debate, and likely going to be the entirety of Gov Bench, is one that is pretty presumptuous insofar as they do not prove it. One that assumes that people's logical calculus be completely overridden by this romanticization of culture. And I think that for this very reason, in their failure to understand how necessarily human beings work in decision making, they already lose today's debate. Before I get into what O wants to posit to you in today's debate, a few key responses towards OG. Number one, on this entire analysis about how protests and stuff is going to die down completely, the point at which time we romanticize things such as moving on as a coping mechanism, my simple response to that is that it's extremely unlikely insofar as you don't go to the metric to prove that this romanticization just completely takes away the entirety of like the decision-making process and probability calculations that go into making decisions. If I, as a protester, knew that this decision would likely be successful, then there is no reason why I would opt into this romanticized coping mechanism. Because the point in which time that you need to understand in OG and panel recognize this, that the motion doesn't call for us to defend washing away these things, rather the romanticization of this trope within society. And these are two uniquely different things with uniquely different impact. OG needs to recognize this. The debate does, the argument just does not work. But before I get into the argument coming from OG now, let's just frame a few key things. I think that we in general agree with what romanticization looks like. But like just to re-clarify a few things, I think that it is saying and believing that these things are good within society. We need to say that sometimes, yes, you do wash away the harms of these things. Meaning to say that for me, I might look at the idea of moving on as a coping mechanism, and I might see the positives and maybe not notice the negatives so much because I am inclined to believe that this thing is good. But secondly, I think you also need to understand what do people who are likely to opt into it look like. This is crucial framing that did not come out from OG. It looks like individuals who oftentimes just can or don't know what to do with their life and their decision-making process in the first place. What this looks like means is oftentimes this is individuals who are disenfranchised by the state, individuals who just have no other decision to make because of the fact that they're in a unique situation that places them towards this. Understand as well that if within this today's debate, you as an individual have a good logical and rational solution towards something and strongly believe in that thing, there is no reason that you'll be inclined into buying into this, because the point in which time that you believe you can achieve solvency through your own means, it is unclear why you would want to rely on something that is romanticized. This entire claim from OG is at best marginal due to this framing. But even if this is untrue and a society at large then necessarily is one that they want to claim will be bought into by this romanticization, they need to then defend the counterfactual. They need to then defend what the world would look like without this entire idea of romanticization of this trope. But then moving on to our case, right? I think that we want to posit you a very simple case, that romanticization leads to individuals who have no other choice, who are desperate for some solvency, achieving that solvency at the very least. That is the case that O wants to posit to you. I think this looks like the poor, the disenfranchised with status quo, who oftentimes need to utilize this to their own advantage because of the fact that, like I mentioned earlier in framing, their unique situation just means that they have no way towards solvency in the first place. Why is this important to you as a panel? Panel, understand this. I think that this is important because our argument to you, number one, shows that this is a necessity to certain interest groups within the debate. But number two, we will also prove to you that these things are uniquely accessible, meaning to say that it helps the people at the bare work and live their lives, in that because of the fact that they are vulnerable, they just need this as an avenue towards solvency of their problems. So why is this true? I think that OO can push to you that it is true for three key reasons. Number one, I think we just need to look at the destitution that exists within status quo. There are vulnerable minorities in many, many countries who do not necessarily have the means towards solvency. Maybe it's because the state oppresses you, and the chances of you fighting against the state, which is oppressing you to the degrees that OG wants to claim, is highly unlikely. At that point in which time, it means that you as a person are continuously unhappy because you keep saying and believing in the trope, oh, I can fight against them, but you keep failing. And then at that point in time, you realize that you do not have the solvency that they want to claim. But number two, we then need to realize that this characterization is the capacity of people in this debate. These people likely no money, which is why they move towards this thing, likely don't have financial capital towards achieving solvency, meaning there's no really push for other changes in this debate because it's hard to achieve these things. But I think that the other thing that we need to engage with is that this is true because of the fact due to the framing that I've already given you. The very fact of the matter is, if you have a method of solvency that you generally believe in, or that the probability of solvency is high, you are unlikely to buy into a romanticized trope, because romanticized tropes are tropes that are portrayed by society as good. If you as an individual believe that you have a better decision to make, you would make the decision. That's an unclear gap. I think that insofar as we show this, we prove the distinction between the two. But before I get into why this is exclusive and how you should weigh this in the round, I'll take a PY for closing.
If society is bad and minorities are oppressed, I mean, you move on and you go where? I mean, how do conditions ever get better?
Understand the nuance coming out of our argument here, because there exists a dichotomy in today's debate which we present to you. Your analysis works if society is good, and that is perfectly fine. But at best, that is a wash, because I am unlikely to take the romanticized trope if I know that solvency is plausible. But the debate really takes place in instances where solvency is implausible, because this is where there's a delta of impact. Because as I've already characterized to you, the point in which time you believe that you can achieve success when, as a matter of fact, you're very, very unlikely to do that, having a romanticized trope that lets you move on and cope with things isn't so bad insofar as your happiness is guaranteed. I think that OG, based on this line of analysis and CG through that PY, I'm going to need to defend how necessarily removing the utility of individuals who just do not have the avenues towards other forms of change is something that is good. I don't see how they're going to do that. Proving exclusivity, two key layers of analysis. Number one, exclusivity in how it has to be romanticized. Understand that they cannot come up here and claim, oh, but if you don't romanticize it, that's perfectly fine. Because when I understand the nuance of this argument, access is something that is only achievable through romanticization. Because most people recognize those who are disenfranchised do not understand nuances as to how they can achieve solvency. It is only when we romanticize these things can it spread easily, and by virtue of it being accessible, it reaches more people and mass, and this is a benefit because more people get to understand it. It needs to be romanticized. But number two, it creates a placebo effect that is a unique benefit as well. Because the point in which time that you believe these things at work, because society conditions you to believe that this is the right choice that works, it means that for this disenfranchised community who have no other avenues to express solvency, they believe that this works, and therefore within their perceived minds, these things work. This buy-in is good because of the fact that we maximize the utility of individuals in the event where their basic needs are oftentimes is difficult to be met. But how do you weigh this in today's debate? Weigh this, number one, by understanding the nuance that I presented. But number two, against this entire illogical stance of how you have to fight against oppressors that you're never going to beat. Insofar as we prove that this impacts certain people, that it's okay to be impacted, but also that this argument works, I think O is already winning.
Great. We thank the speaker for his remarks. Now we invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes. Yeah, of course.
All right. Name's Vince. Shout out pala to CJ, our lucky charm. Shout out to our org, the parliament. So yeah, who? So yeah, let's do this. I wait, timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The only point a media company or something becomes romanticized is when these media companies or people know that it will be palatable to the people, when they know that people would easily opt into it and buy the story in the long run. Hence, we cannot fully credit the entire opening opposition's case that people are entirely rational. We have to note that media paint, like through romanticization, it paints moving on as the only solution. And we also do know that media has a very powerful ability to shift perspectives, i.e. to the idea of contact theory, by exposing you to the ideas again and again until you believe in it. Hence, that's why we believe on certain like propaganda or certain things that we see on social media. It's because we keep seeing it again and again through for Facebook's like algorithm per se, or maybe through the idea, since a lot of people start opting into it, start believing in it because it's what they keep seeing again and again. You're likely to opt into it because of social pressure. It's what the other people around you believe. It's what your families believe. Hence, you should should opt into this because they believe into these things. Hence, what happens on our side is that as media, romanticization, as media paints this as the only solution towards solving these problems, or rather the most effective solution, we tell you that this is actually bad on our side because it's the only thing that people actually do look at to solve their problems at the end of the day. But then let's respond to opening opposition when they're when these struggles they claim that when we do know that these struggles might actually look like failed on minorities per se. When we tell you their struggles are actually looking like these failed laws, when these failed laws are failure of forwarding rights. When the problem with the collective is that you have more variety on what people feel, but because you romanticize, you almost always have to choose to moving on over any other alternatives. When some people might be okay to move on, and some people in the collective don't want to move on, always want to remind you the government of their failures, or some people don't want to forgive at all. So if OO wants to talk about the poor and the disenfranchised, it's more likely that the government wants for them to move on whenever they screw up. And then what happens then if they opt to move on? When firstly, you remove the drive for these people to protest or ask for change. And secondly, this is already happening in the Philippines, where there's so many instances of the government using this rhetoric. When even if OO says there's a placebo effect, that's only going to be eternal. It doesn't necessarily mean that the government would change. It doesn't mean that the perpetrators would be punished. They can't just say that the people won't subscribe to romanticization, as my partner said, as it is what's heavily embedded in mainstream media and the norms of society. Then what then is our counterfactual? Wherein movements have the option to deal with their collective struggles. You create avenues for discussion. You create a marketplace of ideas for movements to ask for accountability, or maybe they confront these big politicians to change their policies per se. And why is then confrontation important? Because confrontation is what then demands for accountability. Confrontation is what allows for new meaningful changes. When if you tell just people to move on, they just skirt through these issues. When the government just tells you, oh yeah, just move on from that, you can just recover from it because you guys are resilient anyways. It's not an issue that's going to occur in the long run. When through confrontation, these people look at the issue per se, look at the reasons why the issue became so big, why these floods are getting worse after a storm per se. When they ask the government to actually solve these issues and make meaningful changes towards their policies. Hence they force the government to create preemptive solutions to prevent more damage into the near future. Additionally, on a societal level, this is actually where we benefit these minorities more, because if we confront, or maybe these people don't forget at all, it is hence where we're able to create more nuanced narratives, have more nuanced narratives to create better policies. This is then where we can ask a trigger warning, where we can ask sexual harassment victims about the struggles that they experience. This is where we can ask rape victims as to how these people, as to how they experience their crimes in the future. Hence, when states are able to create policies to prevent these things, I said preemptive, or maybe like create punishments for the people who do these things. That's after their crime. Hence, we also have to engage on the idea of why moving on is essentially bad on more on an internal level, or more on an internal level. When moving on, when the idea of moving on, they still haven't engaged on this. Is more moving on actually is so bad because it's a solution that you have to do by yourself. That it's something an individualistic solution. Where we do note that the process of coping with certain struggles is that it's a multiple process. You have to move on, you have to move on. You have to confront other people. You talk to other people, or you have to gain a certain type of solvency. The confrontation on talking to other people actually gives a close to that certain type of chapter. Wherein moving on isn't the only solution per se. Only solution per se. When on their side of the house, when moving on actually just allows you to consider it as the only solution. And why is that only bad? Because firstly, you don't try to connect with other people. Coming from Loys, you also lose your support structures because the people aren't necessarily going to be supportive of you. Additionally, moving on gives the very big danger of relapsing towards these things, and it's going to be way more harmful because there's no one to support you at the end of the day. And we tell you this is what actually allows emotions to build up, these negative emotions to build up, which can lead to a lot of mental health issues. I.e., we can see an increase of people who are depressed. I.e., we can see a lot of people who are going to therapy because they're just keeping all of these emotions from themselves because there's a very big expectation for them to just solve these by themselves and not ask other people. Hence the romanticization of moving on, that it's the only process. Hence that if you opt into moving on, you'd suddenly be okay at the end of the day. And what are the narratives on our side that actually change it? How do we actually change it with our counterfactual coming from Loys per se, where we tell that we are going to get these more nuanced narratives. These medias are going to engage on the fact that the protagonist can deal with these multiplies, i.e. the protagonist can move on. It's not the only process per se. They can confront these people, they can talk to other people, and they're going to explore that more and look at how the process of moving on actually looks like, or maybe look on how confrontation looks like, and how this betters the disposition of the protagonist per se. So why does the opening government necessarily win this debate? Because coming from Loys, we've already proven to you on an individual level on how the romanticization of moving on how you're going to lose your support structures, on how this actually hurts you further in the future to the ideas of relapsing and more building up negative emotions. You won't be able to necessarily get that. But then on the idea of a societal level, this is where you actually hurt minorities, when you just force them to just move on from certain issues, not call out these people and ask for better societal changes, better policy changes that would allow to better their state of minds, or maybe better their quality of lives in the near future. And all that's said and done, we proudly take this debate. Thank you.
Great. We thank our speaker for his remarks. Now we invite Deputy Leader.
Okay, can I be seen and heard?
Yung
Yep.
buong opposition side, never pa natin
I think someone is unmuted, but it's fine. I'll take verbal POIs. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there's no way of OG winning this debate for the same reason that CEO has been citing in every single round is the WDC manual. Because if it's a THR motion, if you want to have a counterfactual, which you should have, you need to analyze to me why that is the likely counterfactual that's going to happen. They just say, oh, we will have this thing where people can choose anything within their toolbox, that 2017 HWS extension, but nobody buys that anymore because you need to explain to me why it's going to manifest in that certain way. But even if that is the case and CG wants to beat OG by explaining how that is, CG still isn't going to win this debate because I'm going to explain to you why that alternative is much, much worse for people on the ground. But it's for a few key reasons that Vignesh explains to you, but I'm going to add on when I talk about capitalist structures, because I know they talked about people going and seeing therapy, and I'm sure there's going to be some anecdotes later in the speech about how therapy is so great and those kind of shit. But you need to understand that many people don't have access to therapy. Not that they don't have some counselor there, but they just don't have the money, they don't have the time because they have to work. Because there are these things like capitalist structures that make it hard for these individuals to work within these kinds of self-help ways. They don't read about self-help. So even if you had this huge arsenal of self-help, it's unlikely for them to work in the nuances and understand what exactly they need to use in a certain amount of time. Because yeah, that might be ideal, but that isn't how a majority of society is going to go about these things. It is very, very good when we have one thing that we romanticize and one thing or a few things that we say, these are some ways that you can help yourself, and they are going to opt into those ways because it's easy for them to understand these kinds of things. It requires no capital whatsoever, and they can engage in them and hopefully, cope with whatever the problem is. A few responses to OG then. The first thing we hear about is freedom, because they are locked into that idea. I think they don't understand the huge amounts of mitigation coming from Vignesh's speech, which is that, yeah, it's a virtue not to lie. We tell people it's really good to tell the truth. But if there were a circumstance where I had to lie, I would probably lie. Like I would just make up some personal anecdote if that means me winning the debate. But we have our own discretion to decide when things are so much better for me to go in another pathway. And understand this exists to the individuals who have that opportunity to choose different things because they understand these different things. This is engaging on the stakeholders that we don't even think are that important at the end of the day. But understand this. We do agree that in some instances when we aren't able to see the marginal difference between which is the best way for them and they opt into, moving on, we think that's a marginal harm because they aren't able to see it so obviously. But when it's so obvious that they should protest because it's a very likely for them to win this protest or whatever, likely to succeed, then they probably will because they have some sort of thinking capability at the end of the day. They aren't just governed by these big brother narratives that I explained to you exactly what it is to do. But even if it was massive levels of indoctrination, this is the only thing that they do because they love the media. They're probably going to placebo themselves, because I don't think the response from OG about placebos not working work. But I still don't think that is where the debate takes place. The last thing I want to talk about is the government telling you to move on. Because understand in this THR motion, we are defending status quo. So we are defending how it's been romanticized with the status quo. I want to ask all members of the panel to think about the time in which any piece of media has romanticized the time the perpetrator asks you to move on. Why is this the case? We've never seen this. We don't accept this in status quo. That is not a valid characterization of how it is that these things look, because people don't say, you move on, I hurt you, but you need to move on. That likely doesn't happen in most instances, especially a government towards its people. I don't think this is something that's going to be normalized at the end of the day. Now on to why our case is amazing. How the narrative perpetuates. We are probably explain to you that it's likely going to be, I'm not going to take a PR emoji. It's likely going to manifest to the individuals that need it at the end of the day. Why do we care about these individuals? Because they need it at the end of the day. These are vulnerable people who become cogs of the machine, who are the worst stakeholders because they just don't have access to the types of therapy and self-help and probably the alternatives that CG is going to talk about. So I think it would make sense to make sure that these individuals have something that's easy to understand, easy for them to opt to, and not going to require huge amounts of capital. Even if there are cases where it's like a hit and miss and it doesn't work, I think it's better than the alternative where they don't do anything at all. But even in the cases that it doesn't work, I don't think they're continuously going to keep trying and moving on. If it just keeps that not working, they're probably going to seek other forms of help if the problem was that serious to begin with. But I want to talk about protests as well, because I think that's the CG extension. But before that, I'll take closing government if you have anything. They have nothing. When it happens, they can't move on. Like they're trying to talk about things like, oh, when protests, they won't go to protests because, you know, what's going to happen? I think they need to understand where this debate happens, because we have quite a clever framing, but it's still framing that works. And that is that the point in time where success is something that is likely, it is likely that the human, like your own utilitarian calculus is going to override these kinds of monolithic narratives within society. In the same way that I say, we don't not lie all the time, we lie when we think it's good. You know, like we can't just agree with Khan all the time. So the problem with this is they cannot make this debate about the cases where society could have changed and protests could have worked, but they didn't because people didn't galvanize enough. Because the debate happens in instances and likely to happen within instances where society just can't change the system, where it's something that had already happened and they just have to move on because these are things that fundamentally cannot be changed in society. Why is this something that is good? Because the point in time where people can cope with this, I feel that their interpretation of their own lives with Mind You panel is the only thing that matters at the end of the day. How they interpret their own lives are things that are fundamentally important and are going to increase their utility at the end of the day. Even if their material conditions don't change, we argue that those things are unlikely to change on either side of the house. But lastly, I want to talk about another way that this debate can go, something that was kind of mentioned in OG, which was about things like crimes and sexual assault that people are just going to be made to move on. Okay, I'll take you, OG.
You want examples of states wanting people to move on, i.e. the idea of resiliency in the Philippines, i.e. states wanting people to forget the atrocities done by dictators. Hence, we tell you states want people to move on from those things.
I think that the idea of resilience is not the same as the idea of romanticization of moving on that we get from media that's likely shown in the info slide as well. I think these are two clearly different things, and I don't think that OG can win the case on that alone. Because I don't think that people on the ground buy this thing as something that's romanticized. And if the panel believes that this isn't something that people see as right, then it can't be romanticized in status quo. But again, on crimes and sexual assault, why is this that they won't have trigger warning things like rape culture on our side where people say just move on and don't deal with it? I think because that kinds of culture stem from the belief that you don't believe what the person did was wrong, that you don't believe that the sexual assault crime was something that is wrong. And that's why some people were to say like you should move on. I don't think that people will ask you to move on the point in time that you've been wronged, and there's a legal way for you to go against that, or at least a moral way for you to go against these individuals, and something that's going to help you at the end of the day. I don't think this narrative is going to be extended towards those extremes at the end of the day. So why is it that we win this debate? And I don't think Xiao is going to come up with a personal anecdote and beat us here. It's because we explain why it's only likely to be one narrative that at the top. That is one that is easy for people on the ground to understand and interact with. And we say that the best narrative for that to be is moving on, because it's the most time efficient and works within capitalist structures, because it's easy for these people to understand. It doesn't require all the nuances that probably closing teams are going to bring towards mental health. Proud to oppose.
Yeah, we thank the speaker for his remarks. Now we invite the member of government to open the lower house debate. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, you guys in the chat, I'll take one at 5:30. One sec. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, One, it's a narrative debate, which means I'm not sure why opening opposition can identify a particular socio-economic group and like spend 14 minutes in saying why they can't move on at that point of time. Claim that because they have no agency, we should essentially go ahead and regret this narrative. I don't think that's a valid justification. The first thing we would go ahead and argue is in terms of why, on the alternative, which means when you essentially have to move on under all circumstances, it leads to bottling up of emotions and you feeling helpless, which is a more harrowing experience than at least a feeling of power that you get when you confront the situation in the first place to begin with. Firstly, then, I think in terms of the way the narrative pans out is to say that no matter whatever happens to you, you're always gonna like take the next possible step or move on to the next target, etc., and things like that. The problem is you build up a non-addressed residue of emotions that are largely likely to pile up over time, which is to say there could be like emotions and feelings that you have internally as an individual, but you'll never be able to vent that out under any circumstance, or the society is going to restrict you from venting that out in all instances. I think this means that also in circumstances where you could have access to things like therapy, or you essentially could have like resorted to self-help or like talk to like other individuals or counselors about it. And don't let opening opposition get away with this access argument, because I feel I don't think these resources are so inaccessible. I can counterintuitively argue that even if therapy is expensive, you have a lot of apps like self-help app, like what do you call therapy apps that are coming up right now in terms of BetterHelp, etc., that give you like counseling for a very minimal price. So I'm not, and like more and more apps like proliferating the market means that it's more easier for individuals to get access to these apps and not actually go to a physical counselor, if that's what conceptualize this to be, which means there is a variety of, and plus there's like online resources that you can go ahead and access. Like there are like free like community structures, like join Facebook groups and stuff like that. You essentially get access to a greater community where you can talk about things largely in general. One, I think we then prove the access point better than opening government, because they never give you the outlet in terms of how people with lack of resources and agency as keeps hammering for 14 minutes ever get access to. So we think like there are a lot of free resources that you can opt into. The very fact that even the mental health industry is something that's democratizing, etc., and you have a lot of apps, etc., coming up, which means that it's comparatively more easier for individuals to go ahead and access this if they want to. What that does on opening opposition is boxes them out, even if you have access, or even if you had ever the chance to go ahead and access these things in the first place to begin with, because it's never seen as a serious problem. It's never seen as something that you should actually introspect and look into. It's never seen as something that you should anyway give due diligence towards. I think that literally means that these individuals literally are boxed out and like have this emotional residue that builds up over time that literally constrains their ability to essentially like do anything in the future. Because here's the problem, right? As we ask in the POI, if situations are that dire, there's no guarantee in terms of how do you move on to something better. And this is why we point this out, right? They can't simply claim in terms of you move on like in a vacuum. Like they literally need to prove how you can like somehow better your circumstances or essentially ensure that that problem doesn't repeat. All we're going to do from CG is to prove in terms of why you cannot move on to something better. And at best on off bench, the problem is going to cyclically repeat itself because it's never introspected in terms of what you could have done better as an individual in a certain scenario. Maybe in a relationship in which you are being over possessive, or say for example you essentially breach boundaries, but at all points of time, like if you feel that you need to move on from this and like do all of that, I think you'll never self-introspect or also identify problems that you like have done as an individual as well. Also, this symmetrically applies on the other party as well, because the point at which this narrative stays and like applies like as a panopticon, which is other individuals are also likely to self-introspect and like look into themselves in terms of what they can do better and in terms of identifying the red flags within themselves. I think that means that you have a more holistic scenario in which individuals are better cognizant of the problems like that they're facing and are more cognizant in terms of things that they can do better as themselves. Note, we would say that it's obvious that you're not going to change like overnight, but the very fact that you have greater agency to address your problems is something we feel is comparatively better. Compare that on their side of the house, when you always have to move on. I think that's a feeling of helplessness. That's a feeling that you don't have control over your circumstances. That's a feeling that you like cannot do anything, and that's why you literally need to move on. I think that lack of agency and the feeling of helplessness and lack of power is a more harrowing experience for that individual in the first place to begin with, that even builds up that emotional residue and like makes you feel even worse at the end of the day. On our side of the house, at least you get the cathartic emancipation that you still did something, you at least stood up for something, or you still exercised agency. I think that feeling of power is still comparatively better than all of that they talk about in terms of never having that agency, which means when you face that problem subsequently in the future, your always preemptive response is always going to be to move on and never address it, which means I think you're largely likely to be boxed out on their side of the house with never ever having a solution to anything to begin with. I think at that point of time, we proved that there's comparatively more amount of access for individuals in terms of how the markets operate to address this, but it means that also you have greater amount of agency to determine in terms of what you want for yourself, which is even if you don't solve it in the second attempt, but at least in the third, fourth, or the subsequent attempt, you're better able to recognize your own self and have a better understanding in terms of where things are going wrong. I think that is still a marginal improvement, that things never getting better on their side of the house. We want to move on. Yeah, opening up.
You say that you can't change your circumstances, which is exactly what I say about agency. Our side proves that these people can separate themselves from the event and at least change their perception of life, which is likely better than just using your resources on multiple failed protests.
But here's the problem, right? You changing your perception like does not pragmatically solve anything on your side. I mean, I don't understand why perception is something that is value positive in vacuum if it has no utility at the end of the day. We are not saying that we're going to change, we can't change anything, or we're going to change something overnight. It's about the incremental change that you can do, point at which when you recognize and have a sense of agency and a feeling of power to address something. Sure, you're not going to do this overnight. You're not going to do this like on the second attempt, but through the incremental attempt subsequently, there's a greater propensity you have to change situations than living with this false perception in vacuum, which we don't think anyway has any pragmatic utility at the end of the day. Lastly, then in terms of like the entire argument in terms of government structures and protests, etc., I think you still are able to create some shock value, some level of visibilization, some level of like what do you call attention to the problem in the first place to begin with. I think it's also important in terms of policies that you want to push at the end of the day, in terms of, say, for example, affirmative action policies or reservation policies that you want to go for. And that can only happen when groups acknowledge that there has been historical undoing in the past that can literally like lead them to claim benefits now in the future. When always you have to move on and states always perpetuate the narrative, I think at that point of time, it's very difficult for them to get any sort of change and rather continuously live in a cycle of oppression, personally, as well as in terms of a society. For those reasons, wrong.
Great. We thank our speaker for his remarks. Now we invite a member of opposition. Kiki.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. POI, through unmuting yourself, I strictly only takes POI verbally. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Every single gov material on counterfactual is a characteristic of moving on, i.e. processing your feeling and being able to go forward. I'm pretty sure you're confused, Judge, on what the delta is on side government, because there is no delta due to the fact that the problem as to why this occurs is because government simply forgets their burden. Their burden is not to explain why moving on is bad, but rather the romanticization of moving on. Meaning, on their side, there are still going to be people who move on. It's just that there's less emphasis and there's less romanticization of it. And I'm going to tell you why when people move on without the romanticization as their counterfactual is something that is extremely bad. And I'll prove to you why moving on is symmetric on both sides. But firstly, let's talk about the definition of romanticization. I'm going to expand this beyond what OO brings, right? Because OO only talks about putting it on a pedestal, which is true, right? You should put it on a pedestal and say that's the best means of coping. But we will also put the moving on process on pedestal, saying that it is something that is important and so private to you, recognizing the different level of diversity and not minimizing it. The second definition and characteristic of romanticization is that we also shows the adversities that people go through moving on. Like in any movies or shows or whatever, it doesn't show you on simply flip a switch and then you have amnesia about your trauma. Obviously, it's still going to show how long, ugly, and often intimate process it is in this process of this romanticization, right? The third discussion on what healthy moving on looks like. This was like the mental health movement, therapists making content of it, people scrutinizing other people when you force them to move on too soon, and showing multiple methods to move on, and then showing there are exposing people to different types and different layers of moving on, because O only assumes that there's a one size fits all to moving on. On side CO, we understand that there are different struggles and different layers of diversities, but only through your through romanticization, you would have discussion on how we can tackle these different layers of adversity, different types of adversity. This is key because right now people seem to think that there's a one-size-fits-all method to moving on, which is amnesia to OG. But the only way to progress moving on is through this romanticization and have multitude discussion and ensure that it continuously evolves. Let's talk about government counterfactual. Let's talk about why moving on is symmetric on both sides. And this is the counterfactual that they have to defend, because regardless of the romanticization, people would still move on due to three structural reasons. The first is the inherent human nature to want to avoid pain. Obviously, as human, I still want to avoid pain and the trauma that exists within me. The second is that we also have limited capacity to store memories and details, as detailed as possible. So obviously, you would to a certain extent move on and forget about it. The third is the general push from society and yourself to progress. I just want to note that trauma affects you very progress. Obviously, you want to function, and obviously, society also wants to do this. So, know that on site government, regardless of this romanticization, there's an inherent nature from human to still want to move on. The conclusion is, government world is a world where people want and ought to move on, but there are no romanticization, there are no discussion of it. The problem is not accessibility, but rather whether or not there's a discussion on how to move on healthily. And is this mapped on site government due to three reasons. The first is that there's no discussion on how to do it healthily. You always have to face your trauma head on. You can identify if this particular method is healthy. You always have to stick with your trauma and let it live with you for the rest of your day. Well, perhaps that might not be the best method for you. The second is that you also minimize the struggle you have. You minimize the process as something that is easy. Externally, this looks like people saying it's just easy to move on, right? It's not that huge of a deal. It's not so hard. Why are you making such a big deal of it? This also from yourself, not wanting to take the necessary step to actually heal, not wanting to go to therapy, even though it's extremely accessible. Exactly like what CJ says. When you don't put it at a pedestal, people don't activate and use the method that is incredibly accessible to them at the end of the day. The third is that this ensures that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, because people are focused on pushing the method that works for them and not for other people in different types of adversities. The
Right.
conclusion here is that trauma is incredibly complex, and without romanticization, we have a world that generalizes the process of healing. Let's talk about our world, where romanticization and what it does for moving on. The thesis is that romanticization makes something more beautiful. Moving on is hard and incredibly complex. But
Right.
romanticization ensures that there are multiple discussion on how to go through with it and how to, ensure that it becomes healthy for you. There are three structural reasons as to why romanticization is linked to this. The first is that you glorify the effect of moving on. People now take the first step of getting out of the pit to avoid the pain that has been cycling them, to ensure that they can move on with it and take the first step because they want to see the success story that people have shown through the stories of moving on. The second is the evolution of the method of moving on. The problem with the team is that they think there's a one-size-fits-all, and romanticization opens up a lot of things and discussion on the different types of adversity and how we can overcome it and move on through it. The third is say, government might say, you will be gaslight, you just need to move on. It's something that's simple and etc. I think this happens worse on the side when people minimize the process, and romanticization doesn't, where on our side, romanticization focus less on self-blaming, focus more on less self-blaming for yourself, for example, and it becomes more of a healthy process. People continually want to try to fix and see it as a very high pedestal and something that is a very secret process, right? I'll take CG if there's anything. Opening.
Your benefits only accrue when people have an in-depth understanding of moving on. This never happens with romanticization when you have informational shortcuts, when moving on is seen as easy and immediate.
No.
At least on our side, your benefits of discourse happen more with more options.
No. Romanticization leads to discourse where people, there are more healthy methods to move on. When there's no romanticization, there is no discourse. That's the harm that you have to defend. Three impact. The first is agency. This is what OG and CG forget. It's what trauma does to you. It enslaves you from doing what you need to do. You can't work, you can't laugh, you can't proceed with your life. Our site enables individuals to move on in a manner that is more healthy and remove the shackles of their life and ensure that there are more accessible methods of moving on. I'm not saying that the current status quo is perfect, by the way, but at least romanticization ensures that we move the needle a little bit closer to it being better. The second is the progress of method of moving on. More discussion on the best method on how to do it yourself. The third is that there's a more healthy and equitable method, saying when you should be ready to do it and how you should do it, because we see it as a very sacred and as a very high pedestal moment for you as an individual, right? The way here is three. The first is that it increased agency. We have proven why moving on is so vital because it enables you to access your agency that's been robbed by you by this trauma. Agency is the most important thing in your life because anything that matters in your life happens because of agency. Money matters because of our agency and our ability to make choose and say that it is important. The second is relevant of proposition counterfactual romanticization. Note that their only burden is to defend the romanticization of moving on, not moving on in and of itself. So far, they've only telling you the harm of moving on. The third is that only explain how people can change perception. TG says you should have a pragmatic change. We co-opt both because only on our side does it get accessible to the different circumstances that you have as an individual. I just want to tell you that trauma is incredibly complex and should not be generalized. Our side enables more discussion and more exposure for it, and the world is also the better for it. Proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for his remarks. Now we invite the Whip of Government to enter the bench case. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, POI is in the chat. So I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, people fight for a cause and a reason, but at the moment in which you move on, you necessarily devalue the significance of your experience. This is going to be internally traumatizing, toiling, and individuals are going to be feeling helpless at the end of the day. What I'm going to be doing as WIP is just to respond to the MO first, and then moving on to talking about why the member of government's extension is going to be the most significant in this round, and then moving on to outweighing OO and then addressing OG. So first of all, I think that the general case line from closing opposition is incredibly capacity driven, but not incentive driven. So the reason why we are going to win this clash by talking about why people are not likely going to opt into the counterfactual that they're building is because they're defining what romanticization is, but there's no warrant regarding how romanticization of moving on is something that the individuals under some kind of psychological distress will default to when compared to feeling helpless and not knowing what to do, right? Like we say, sure, people want to avoid the pain. Like that's what the member of opposition said, but you're literally gaslighting yourself to literally force yourself to forget about the pain. But how likely is that going to be, especially when the gravity of the situation is going to be quite large, right? Because the harm is already done and you have minimal number of people to talk about. Because after you move on, let's say, you're discouraged from talking about it more, even when you want to. As what my member of government has told you, at the moment in which you feel helpless, and then because moving on, like others are kind of like coercing it on you because they probably don't want to like deal with it, or B, just don't think that you can reap much out of, you know, resolving the conflict. They just like forcibly or like maybe passively coerce you to move on. That's when you actually cut off any kind of support network. Therefore, even after you move on, your condition is not going to be bettered on closing opposition. The path to victory on opposition is to prove the mechanism as to what kind of support people are likely going to have after they move on, because supposedly we want, you know, better lives for everyone. The outcome has to be good. We block the mechanism because what we tell you is that once the others disregard and lift the gravity of your struggles, people are trapped alone. The psychology of the victim is also in vulnerable condition. That's exactly what my MG told you. You need some kind of external output and seek for validation so that there's some kind of resolution to the internal dissonance that you're facing. So then why is what Rita told you as the member of government going to be far significant than the other three houses? Number one, we actually focus on the victim closure, right? This is the most justifiable metric to judge around because they're the ones who actually suffer some kind of harm. Now, what the government bench or op bench is telling us is without any warrants as to why they're just told to move on, like just kind of forget about it because it seems to be the only choice, right? We first want to challenge the premise that that is going to be literally the only choice. What Rita told you is that there's probably some kind of resources that are accessible to you because of things like the rising access to mental health care, or you don't even need money to have friends, to be quite frank, right? Like probably people go to school, they have jobs, or like they interact, they exist, they have enemies. There are many different ways to have a friend and someone to vent to. Like therefore, some kind of like accessibility towards like making yourself feel better and like having some kind of external output is present. So it is, the world is not as extreme as what the opening opposition characterizes. Therefore, there is propensity for the other people to actually want to help you out, right? And then what we also think that the reason why this is really important is because the point of this debate is not merely dichotomizing whether moving on is the only option or not, but discussing how the community can also best restore the harm. This extension works regardless of whether information shortage is present or not, this is what the opening government says. And also what Rita tells you is that the construction of moving on is happening because people devalue the experiences first, and that's also traumatizing for the victim. They feel helpless. Therefore, individuals are likely going to feel really nihilistic about things. There are a bunch of second order impacts to this, right? Number one, people are less compelled to do bystander intervention in the future when they see other people are in conflict. Therefore, people are forced to just move on and not talk about it again. But number two, when people try to access other counterfactuals after being told to move on, other people see them as inefficient and still like that loser who still holds a lot of grudges, right? Which we think is like a double punishment for the victim. But also, why do we outweigh OO? Before I move on to that, yes, OOPOI.
We identify incapacitated individuals as the most vulnerable. The idea that keep trying, maybe change something is extremely uncertain and capital intensive compared to moving on and feeling happier. And we did this without any convenient characterization of mental health care.
Yeah. So even if people cannot access like therapy or whatever, I already dealt with that, but they can still probably have friends. But then the better question is, so then what do you do with those people after they move on, right? I just don't think that question has been answered. So then why do we outweigh OO? They say that moving on should be romanticized for financially vulnerable people, but then A, this gives more power to the perpetrators, as our member of government has said. But then B, more importantly, even if people have no other choice than to move on, the trail of discomfort still resides within that individual. There's like literally lack of any bystander intervention, and that even if these people want to access any other external help after moving on, that's likely going to be discouraged or frowned upon because now other people, like their close surroundings, just think that, oh, didn't you already move on? Like, what's the problem, right? So then therefore that kind of internal struggle is going to be magnified on the side of opposition. But then C, we also want to clash with the likelihood of the counterfactual, right? It probably is not the case that moving on is the only solution. It's like the world is not black and white, like to the opposition bench. Like, since people do have friends to a certain extent or like other resources, therefore the likelihood counterfactual is not moving on. It's not the only solution, but then the romanticization of moving on, the friends actually like saying that your experiences probably do not matter and that you feel traumatized again for wanting to probably speak out about the issue, right? So then therefore the difference is probably more unresolved dissonances manifesting in the victim, and then the victim now is like losing friends or like any other support networks that they probably could have maintained if they were still to talk to other people or access any other counterfactual. Even if you buy their framing that people have no choice but to move on, they don't engage with the comparative of like what happens after you move on, therefore OO cannot be winning this round. What the DLO says is that society can't move on. But then like in interpersonal conflict, that is probably unlikely, right? Because a perpetrator probably also felt some kind of psychological effect. They might even once be victims again. And we also have a bunch of social narratives, such as like taking the responsibility of the actions that you have taken. That's a little bit of a too extreme context that OO is going for. Lastly, why do we outweigh OG? Because they don't really talk about how this process is going to be constructed, while as we tell you that the aftermath or the process is going to be that, number one, the prerequisite is devaluing the experience so that the trade-off is going to be worth it. The trade-off of you moving on is going to be worth it. That inherently is going to be constructed by outsiders who are telling you that your experience is not going to be that serious, but also like secondarily, you're going to be feeling more helpless afterwards. I think they talk a bunch of like, about media and like social media coverage, probably symmetric on either side. But what we can tell you is that the harm of consenting into this choice is that you're likely going to be losing all the other support networks that you probably would have had otherwise. And then we think that the counterfactual is going to be significantly better. Therefore, proud to be on government.
Great. With that, let's